We begin with the dramatic developments in Venezuela last weekend, when the United States sent its military in to seize President Maduro and his wife, transporting them to New York to stand trial on criminal charges. Richard Haass has spent his career in and out of government advising on foreign policy. He is senior counselor at Centerview Partners, president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, and author of the Substack newsletter, Home and Away.
When there's so much uncertainty, it's helpful to know where you're headed. What is the goal of the United States government right now, as far as you can discern it?
It is not regime change. It is not democracy or human rights. I think the goal of the United States, at a minimum, is access for American companies, American oil companies, to Venezuela's oil sector, which is large, but not quite as large as the statistics lead people to believe. Yes, you've got 17, 18% of the world's supply, but a lot of it's hard to get to. A lot of it's not the greatest quality crude. It's in terrible disrepair. But anyhow, I think that's priority number one. Whether there are other priorities, for example, to stop Venezuelan support of Cuba, even though as much or more comes from Mexico, but there's that. Whether to wean Venezuela from Russia, China, and others, obviously to keep them out of the drug trade. So I think there may be secondary or subsidiary objectives, but the principal objective, and the president talked about it, 15, 20 times at the Saturday press conference last week, was the oil access.
When you were in the State Department with Secretary Powell, you were head of, as you say, policy planning, not policy prediction. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen, but in order to plan, you have to think about a range. What's the range of possibilities right now in Venezuela? What's the best it can be? What's the worst it can be?
The best it could be is what we just described actually holds. That you have a situation there where you have more continuity than change, and the United States does not have to get more involved, more intrusive with boots on the ground or anything like that. There's not massive violence, and we develop a growing economic relationship. The bad news with that is you obviously don't have democracy, or particularly human rights. The average Venezuelan person might be slightly better off, but it's much more continuity than change. The bad scenarios are things unravel. Essentially, conditions of instability. It may not be as, you had chaos in Iraq within a year. So I'm not predicting chaos, but you asked me for the menu. At the other end of the menu is a real breakdown of order, that rival groups essentially start to slug it out.
Now we hear, it's a little unclear, the United States is sort of going to take some of the oil, a fair amount of the oil, sell it, put it into account, and then maybe give some back to the Venezuelans, sort of like an allowance. How is that going to work?
Well, I think one of the interesting parts of that, because I've read the same stuff, is how do you put it, what's the sharing arrangement, David? How rich is this allowance? And this is exactly the sort of thing at some point. Nationalism hasn't disappeared in the world. Nationalism's a really powerful force. So at some point, the people challenge the Venezuelan government saying, hey, why are we giving this generous or sweetheart deal to the Americans? Why are we not keeping this here? That's exactly the dynamic, by the way, that decades ago led to all the nationalizations, not just in Venezuela, but around the world. Deals with outsiders, with the international oil companies, were seen as way too generous to them, and countries basically said, hey, this is our sovereign wealth. Why are we giving so much of it away? So the idea that argument would not surface sooner rather than later, I kind of think it will.
What are the likely consequences beyond Venezuela? Start with Latin America, for example. Certainly Colombia's come to people on the president's mind, as well as Cuba, maybe Mexico.
All of the above, and there's Canada and others, and then we get a little bit farther afield to Greenland. I think Cuba is probably the one that most worried because it's not doing well. It's not a failed state only because of external support, so they're going to have to probably find some substitutes. They've got Mexico. I don't know what Russia would be prepared to do. I think they're probably the most nervous. The president has attacked the president of Colombia, which is too bad in some ways, because Colombia was one of the great success stories of American foreign policy. People often criticize versions of nation building. Well, we kind of got inside Colombia, and it wasn't a change of regime, but with the existing regime, we helped them deal with their civil war. We helped them deal with the drug issues. Mexico is a funny issue because it's not where the government is part of the problem, except they're indirectly part of it because they're either unable or unwilling or both to deal with the cartels. They're not meeting their sovereign obligation to make sure that their territory isn't used as a drug production and trafficking. So the question there is what might at some point we do about it. There's been periodic threats that we would use military force against the cartels. I think Canada is more just a scratchy relationship. I don't sense any enthusiasm, shall we say, for it to become a 51st state. Ironically enough, Venezuela is slightly closer to becoming the 51st state right now in a de facto way than is Canada. And I think the other big question mark is Greenland, farther afield geographically. But there's been so many pronouncements by the administration, both from a strategic argument as well as from a resources argument, that I actually take this seriously as a possibility. Though what's baffling to me, and here I am, an old-fashioned diplomat, if the United States wanted a more intimate strategic and economic relationship with Greenland, I think it's there for the offing. That's why God invented diplomats. You send somebody there, you negotiate the terms of it, you make it generous to them because it's important that. How it's been allowed to come to this, I truly don't understand, David.
Greenland is another territory, not country, but territory in its own right. It is under the protection of Denmark.
Yes, sir.
The sovereignty is with Denmark. You said to me when the national security strategy first came out, wow, look at this because of the Monroe Doctrine. Venezuela, Colombia, Cuba, even Canada, you could say that's Western Hemisphere.
Right.
Greenland's not, last time I checked. And it is theoretically subject to NATO protections.
100%. So you're right. It's kind of, what it reflects is not the Western Hemisphere focus of this administration, which Venezuela can be explained by. It's more the commercial and economic focus of this administration. And that's where I think it makes sense. This administration essentially sees foreign policy more in terms of homeland security and economic welfare. So they're worried about drugs, they're worried about immigration, and they're into the business of promoting business. And I think Greenland falls a little bit into all that, but it also shows something else. A lack of concern, I don't have a word for it, David, for Europe. I mean, the two great theaters of history for the last 100+ years are Europe and Asia. And this is an administration that's dialing a lot of its attention towards this part of the world. If you connect the dots, it looks like we're moving towards a world what you might call of spheres of influence, where the United States is preoccupied here, Russia and Europe literally slug it out in their part of the world. We'll see China has something of a free hand in its part of the world. And we've gone voluntarily, which is the strangest part of this to me, as someone who studies history, from being a truly global power to being something more of a regional power.
The United States is pulling back from Europe, as you put it, at a time when Europe could be seen as being under contest from Russia, given what's going on in Ukraine. President Putin must be watching this. What does the Venezuelan development say to President Putin?
Yeah, whatever narrow setback he's experienced in Venezuela because of the Russian connection, whatever humiliation he might feel there, I think is offset. He's got to like the larger thing here. He's got to like the fact that we're demonstrating that great powers have the right to act with a pretty free hand against leaders they believe are illegitimate. He listens to that and he goes, where have I heard that before? He's got to like the fact that this separates us even more from the Europeans. He's got to like the fact that the United States is more preoccupied with the Western Hemisphere. So I think for Vladimir Putin, this is all good. One of the implications, by the way, since you raised it, David, this has, though, for this negotiation about Ukraine, the war, ending the war, which I think the chances of which are remote, I think they've become more remote. Just think about it. If you're President Zelensky, American security assurances in the current context, hard to imagine you would place your country's fate in America's word that we would be there for them. I think you're going to want a lot more than that if you're President Zelensky, and whatever he's going to require is going to be way too much for Vladimir Putin to accept. So I'm afraid, we're about to mark the end of 4 years of this phase of the war. My unhappy prediction is we're about to go well into year 5.